The scent of old wood is a time capsule. Every faded wallpaper patch, every scuff mark on the oak floor is a page in a history book only one man can read. He walks these halls, a solemn librarian of ghosts and echoes. This sprawling house is not haunted by spirits, but by the relentless, beautiful burden of what was, laughter embedded in the plaster, secrets whispered into the heavy curtains. He knows the weight of this archive, but he is in his final act, and when he closes his eyes for the last time, the stories held captive here will be released into uncaring silence. The structure will stand, but the meaning will vanish forever. The silence in the archival residence has a particular density to it, a heavy velvet quality that presses against the eardrums. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of all the sounds that are no longer here. I am author Preston Sterling, 81, and I move through this Victorian husk, which is less a home now and more a mausoleum built entirely of moments. My thin build feels even slighter against the sheer mass of the history surrounding me. My posture is permanently stooped, not entirely by age, but by the gravitational pull of recollection. My eyes, though keen, are perpetually tired from seeing too much that no longer exists in the physical world. The year is 2024. The daylight is thin, filtered through the immense oaks lining the avenue, bathing the worn oak floors in a muted sepia. I hear the distant rumble of a car, a modern sound that feels utterly alien to the deep-seated quietude of this place. This house, this three-story behemoth on the quiet tree-lined avenue, is the only place left where I am entirely comprehensible. Outside, I am merely an old man. Here, I am the chief curator of a century. My solitude was momentarily broken this morning by the arrival of the independent property assessor, a young man named Mr. Finch, who saw wood rot where I saw the ghosts of spilled tea. He was here for the final appraisal, an event initiated with cold efficiency by my son, Samuel David Sterling, 54, who views this immense collection of plaster and lumber purely as a financial asset. Sam is tall, successful, and professionally dressed. He carries the air of a man constantly moving forward, utterly detached from the retrospective burden that holds me captive. He only sees the house through the lens of investment returns, a necessary liquidation. Mr. Finch's footsteps were loud, sacrilegious thuds against the delicate resonance of the house. He walked quickly through the expansive rooms, measuring, calculating, oblivious to the fact that he was treading on the very soul of the Sterling family. Structurally sound, Mr. Sterling, he clipped, his voice devoid of inflection. But the wallpaper, significant peeling in the main hall, and the floors, especially here near the bay window in the sitting room, that groove is quite deep. A cosmetic defect that will require sanding or replacement during renovation. I stood in the hearthroom, rooted, gazing at the area near the mantelpiece he was pointing toward. Cosmetic defect, I murmured, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. That defect is known only to me as the depth groove. It is not an imperfection. It is a permanent marker of joy, of vibrant, chaotic life. I stood there, and the present evaporated. It was 1978, Christmas morning, a blinding explosion of wrapping paper and early light. Samuel, then only 4, had received the fire truck had demanded from Santara Large. Heavy metal replica with real rubber tires. He drove it with a ferocious intensity, pushing it across the freshly polished oak, ignoring the large Persian rug. The specific momentum, the excitement, fueled by pure childhood delirium, created the perfect, enduring abrasion. The sound of the tiny metal wheels carving into the wood lives louder in my memory than Mr. Finch's dismissive voice. I remembered Catherine's high, spontaneous laughter and the quick, sharp intake of Eleanor's breath, laughter and exasperation combined. "It tells a story," I heard myself say, weakly. Finch merely scribbled on his clipboard. Yes, a costly one, I imagine. He moved on to the kitchen, his flashlight sweeping across the peeling paint of the doorframe. There, hidden beneath layers of touch-up paint that I have always avoided disturbing, is the ledger of heights. Faint pencil markings trace the growth of generations, dating back to 1943, when I, as a spindly 8-year-old, insisted on being measured against the doorframe for the first time. The final, highest mark belongs to Sam, just before he left for university. These are not pencil lines. They are vectors of time, mapping the trajectory of lives that began and accelerated within these walls. Finch saw only an unsightly detail that should be painted over. He spoke of modernizing, opening up the space, removing the clutter of built-in cabinetry. Every word was a tiny demolition charge aimed at my heart. He left shortly after, leaving behind the chilling documentation of the house's future, a future where it would be stripped of its narrative, its history reduced to a simple monetary figure. The remaining hours of the day stretched, viscous and heavy. I ate a small, tasteless dinner and waited for the night. I always wait for the night. The daytime demands clarity. The night permits the necessary therapeutic delusion. I began in the main hall, touching the worn mahogany banister. I narrated softly to the empty air, my voice a dry rasp against the silence. "This banister," I whispered, running my fingers over the deepest indentation near the bottom. "This is where I learned to slide down, despite my father's persistent warnings." That specific dent, my mother hit the side with her elbow, trying to catch me the year the Great War ended. 1945. I moved into the hearth room again, pausing near the bay window. The depth groove. I knelt, feeling the wood. It was rougher than I remembered, or perhaps the memory smooths the edges of pain, but leaves the edges of joy sharp. I spoke directly to the indentation, addressing it like an interlocutor. You are the proof, aren't you? Proof that Sam laughed so hard he cried that morning. Proof that he had soft, chubby hands, and that his ambition was measured in the speed of a toy truck. When I go, who will understand what you truly are? You will just be grit beneath a new owner's rug. Your testimony will be filed away forever. The weight of being the sole librarian pressed down on me, the ultimate, terrifying burden. Every time I touch a surface, I release a memory. If I am not here to release it, it remains trapped, inert. The walls hold the laughter, but they cannot tell the story of the laughter. I continued into the smaller, quieter areas. I reached the library corner armchair, an overstuffed, faded velvet piece tucked into a nook near the back staircase. It was still dented from decades of use, conforming perfectly to the shape of the body that spent the most time there. This chair was the quiet corner where Eleanor read her books. She wasn't always reading. Sometimes she was just sitting, the scent of lavender and starch faint around her, grounding the domestic chaos. Her presence was always an anchor. I sat down, and the old springs groaned a familiar welcome, a sound that felt more intimate than most conversations you've had in the last 20 years. I remembered the exact concentration on her face when she was engrossed in a particularly challenging novel. her brow slightly furrowed, her lips slightly parted. The memory wasn't a static image, it was a full sensory experience. I could almost feel the weight of her hand resting on my knee as I passed by. "Ellie," I sighed into the empty air, "you left too soon. You weren't supposed to leave me in charge of all of this. My final destination on the nightly inventory is always the kitchen. It is the heart of the house, though now cold and sterile." I walked past the ledger of heights, tracing my fingers along the fading pencil marks one last time. Then I turned toward the small, dark storage area attached, the copper pantry. The pantry is characterized by high, narrow shelves and the distinctive, perpetual aroma of dried herbs, a scent that defies time and cleaning solvents. This lingering scent, heavier tonight than usual, is the ghost of Catherine's legendary Sunday dinners 1963. Catherine Eleanor's mother was a culinary force, and she used rosemary generously, scattering it like confetti over roasting potatoes and mutton. I reached for the highest shelf, seeking the small glass jar, the decanter of dried rosemary. It wasn't the original jar from 1963, of course, but it had held the spice, replenishing its scent for 50 years, acting as a fixed point in a constantly shifting world. As I took it down, my elbow brushed against something forgotten. Tucked far into the rear corner, a small, square, slightly warped wooden box, covered in dust so thick it felt like fine velvet. I hadn't seen this box in decades. My heart gave a strange, painful lurch. This was the pantry revelation. I carried the box into the faint light of the kitchen and opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a small, crudely drawn watercolor painting, a depiction of this very house, but rendered in bright, almost childlike colors. It was a painting Eleanor had done long before her passing appearance, 65, when she was just starting to feel the first creeping shadows of her illness, yet still perpetually apron-clad and radiating a warm, grounding presence. Tucked beneath the painting was a small, folded note, brittle with age. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Arthur, my dear, if you find this, it means I put it away quite well. I wanted to leave proof that we loved this house exactly as it is, not for what it might become. I worry, Arthur. I worry that when the last of us is gone, the stones will forget the warmth. I worry that the silence will swallow our laughter entirely. Please, promise me you won't let the house forget who we were." Reading her words, her specific fears about time and forgetting, ripped a fissure in the emotional facade I maintained. I hadn't been crying yet tonight, only narrating, cataloguing, but now the tears came hot, sudden, and entirely overwhelming. Eleanor Ellie Hayes Sterling, deceased, had feared this very scenario, the house holding the memories, but no one left to validate them. She too recognized the profound dilemma of being the witness. This was the climax of my grief, the realization that even she, the pragmatic keeper of domestic harmony, had foreseen the coming oblivion. I held the note, the rosemary scent thick around me, recalling the exact intonation of her voice, the way she would tap the counter when she was anxious. "I tried, Ellie," I whispered to the note. "I am trying, but who promises the house? Who promises the plaster?" The discovery of the note crystallized the central conflict. My greatest dread isn't merely that a new owner will gut the house. It's that the history, the actual essence of our lives, will be released into the uncowering ether, unmoored and meaningless. I am the tether, and the tether is fraying. I stayed in the kitchen until the first signs of dawn, the painting of the vibrant, impossibly colorful house resting on my lap. The early light returned the house to its current, silent, staid, old, tired, and waiting. Later that morning, sitting on the porch swing, sipping lukewarm tea, the final memory unfolded, the driveway retrospective. A family across the street was engaged in the timeless ritual of teaching a child to ride a bicycle. The small boy wobbled furiously, his father jogging alongside, hands hovering, offering reassurance that he wouldn't fall. The sharp, nervous cry of the boy, the slightly strained encouragement of the father. It was a soundtrack I knew intimately. My gaze drifted to the driveway of the Archiville residence. The concrete here is cracked and stained with oil that has long since dried, but I saw only a clean, pristine surface baking in the summer sun. I saw Samuel David Sterling, 54, as he was nearly 50 years ago, struggling on that very patch of concrete. He was 5. His face set in a grim mask of determination, his small legs pumping awkwardly on his new two-wheeled bicycle. I was the father running beside him, my back straighter than, my voice louder. Eleanor was standing on the porch, perpetually apron-clad, ready with a bandage or a hug. I remembered the moment Sam first achieved flight, that singular, terrifying second of perfect balance when the bike stopped being a machine and became an extension of the will. His sheer, unadulterated triumph, a sound that soared above the avenue. I remembered standing back, watching him pedal away, realizing he was already leaving us, inch by terrifying inch. Now, I watched the neighbor's child, and the memory was so sharp it was holographic. It was not like Sam learning to ride. It was Sam learning to ride, relived entirely through my senses. But the moment the neighbor's boy finally found his balance and zipped down the street, the vision faded. I was left alone, watching the present. I am the only one who can place Sam's triumph on this specific, cracked concrete. I am the last living witness. When I am gone, the neighbor's child will continue to ride his bike. But the story of Sam's ride will stop existing in the shared reality of the world. It will simply dissipate. The profound tragedy of my existence is this: the beauty of the memories is inseparable from the terrifying burden of their singularity. They are mine alone, and therefore they are mortal. I stood up slowly, the movement stiff and deliberate. The house loomed behind me, silent, vast, holding a century of vibrant life within its walls. I knew I couldn't stop the appraisal, nor could I prevent Sam from selling it. The house, like a physical body, was destined for transformation and eventual decay. But perhaps Eleanor's request, the plea in that brittle note, wasn't about stopping time. Maybe it was about definition. I turned back toward the front door, looking at the peeling paint and the warped frames. I walked inside, not with the hurried steps of Mr. Finch, nor the ghost-like tread of my nocturnal survey, but with the measured pace of a man undertaking his final, defining task. I went into the hearth-room, found a permanent marker, black and bold, and returned to the depth groove. I knelt down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and next to the significant scratch that commemorated 1978, I wrote in firm, clear script, Samuel. Age 4, fire truck. I walked to the kitchen doorframe, careful not to smudge the fragile ledger of heights. I found a space just below the final, highest mark, and wrote, A P. Sterling, 2024, the last keeper. I walked through the remaining rooms, placing simple, declarative labels on the key artifacts of my existence. Alina's quiet corner, written lightly on the library corner armchair's frame. Catherine's rosemary, 1963, taped carefully near the copper shelf in the pantry. They were small, desperate acts of defiance against oblivion. They would likely be sanded away, painted over, or discarded by the next owner, but for now they were there. They were the validation. I settled back into the library corner armchair, the silence returning, but feeling less hostile this time. The memories are trapped, yes, but for this one moment they had been given voice, assigned an archive number, and registered in the physical world. The dread had not vanished, but the fear of being derelict in my duty had. When I finally follow Eleanor, and the house is silenced, the architecture may forget the why of the scratch, but for a brief, shining moment, I ensured that the physical scar would not be mistaken for a mere defect. I did not let the house forget who we were. The history will eventually cease to be recalled, but until the hammers fall, the stories will remain captive, weighted down by my final loving labels. I closed my eyes, the familiar scent of the rosemary clinging faintly to my clothes, and I rested in the knowledge that I had fulfilled the promise. The archive was catalogued, and the sole librarian had completed his duty. The deep, heavy silence finally felt like peace. The measured rhythm of my breath was the only sound now, a dry, brittle counterpoint to the deep, heavy silence of the house. I stood back from the kitchen door frame, the black marker ink drying rapidly, stark against the faded pencil lines of the ledger of heights. The final scrawled inscription, AP Sterling, 2024. The last keeper felt like a legal codicil, a desperate attempt to notarize a century of fleeting moments. It was an inventory undertaken by the soon-to-be defunct archivist. The profound sense of displacement that had shadowed me since the appraisal finally began to lift, replaced by a strange, sharp clarity. It was not enough to merely remember these things. The architecture itself needed to be armed with the narrative. If the memory of the why had to die with me, then the memory of the what must be made indelible. A physical protest against the clinical indifference of Mr. Finch and the distant pragmatism of Sam. I carried the black marker like a weapon of preservation. My journey continued deeper into the structure, a systematic patrol of the history I was determined to defend. The house felt responsive now, less a mausoleum and more a canvas of living documentation. The peeling wallpaper, the worn oak, the pervasive scent of old dust and time, all waited for their designation. I returned to the copper pantry. It was still dark, narrow, and intensely fragrant. The aroma of dried spices, primarily rosemary, had always provided a comforting continuity, a physical manifestation of Eleanor's enduring domesticity and Catherine's formidable culinary spirit. The faint scent, usually ethereal, seemed weighted tonight, saturated with the emotion of the recent discovery, the small wooden box, and Eleanor's note. I gently replaced the decanter of dried rosemary on the copper shelf. It was nestled amongst other, mostly forgotten jars, crystallized ginger, bay leaves, brittle with age, and a few tins of exotic spices bought for a long-abandoned international dinner party 40 years ago. Each jar was a potential trigger, but the rosemary was the fixed point, the heart of the pantry's history. I knelt, the floor cool and slightly gritty beneath my thin trousers, and focused my attention on the immediate vicinity of the decanter. This was where the alchemy occurred, where the raw ingredients transformed into sustenance and tradition. Catherine's Sunday dinners, back in 1963, were not merely meals, they were declarations of family vitality. The sheer volume of preparation required a specific kind of focused chaos, a rhythmic pounding, chopping, and stirring that was the true soundtrack of my early marriage. I leaned forward, inhaling deeply. I could almost hear the clatter of the heavy copper pots and Catherine's robust, contralto voice issuing instructions to a younger, less confident Eleanor. Eleanor, perpetually apron-clad, had inherited the duty of the dinners, but never Catherine's ferocious intensity. Eleanor's cooking was warm, grounding, and always smelled exactly like this, rosemary and a gentle warmth. I took the marker and wrote directly onto the smooth, copper-edged shelf, just beneath where the rosemary decanter rested. Catherine's Rosemary, 1963, the soul of Sunday. I stepped back, dusting my hands. The inscription was simple, but it was a decree. It transformed a piece of hardware into a historical monument. A future owner, seeing this, might choose to scrub it away, but they would do so knowing they were erasing a name and a date, not just a stain. The memory, previously captive within the wood and the copper, had briefly escaped and left its indelible signature. My focus then shifted to the architectural body of the house itself. I moved slowly, running my hand along the heavy plaster walls of the main stairwell. "The plaster holds the laughter," Eleanor had written in her implied query. But how much laughter can plaster truly hold? I began to walk through the upper floors, areas now largely unused, the third floor, attic bedrooms, where Sam and I used to build elaborate cities of blocks during rainy days. These rooms were darker, colder, draped in white sheets that looked like waiting ghosts. I didn't label the furniture. The furniture could be sold, dispersed, stripped of context. I labeled the structure. In the small, sun-drenched nook on the landing of the second floor, where Eleanor used to catch the afternoon light to darn socks, I found a faint, circular water stain on the original wainscoting. I remembered the exact moment of its creation. Sam, then 9, attempting to perform a scientific experiment involving a battery, a small glass of tap water, and a highly unstable chemical reaction. He had managed to spill the water, terrified that I would be angry. I hadn't been angry, I had been astonished by his focus. I wrote next to the stain, my handwriting more controlled now, imbued with a strange official confidence, "Sam's experiment." Age 9, pure inquiry. Every step felt like the application of an anti-oblivion sag. The house, which had previously oppressed me with the sheer weight of its unshared history, now felt like an accomplice, a willing participant in this desperate, final archive project. I descended the grand staircase again, the worn mahogany banister feeling solid beneath my hand. I paused at the bottom, near the deep indentation from 1945, the one I had described to the empty air during my nocturnal walk. I had already whispered the story. Now I would cement the date. 1945. End of war. Arthur's flight. The repetition of the names, the dates, the specific moments, was a ritualistic invocation. It was less about informing a future stranger and more about affirming to myself, to Eleanor's ghost, and to the silent walls, that this life mattered. The emotional intensity built as I progressed. The initial melancholy had given way to a quiet, focused fury against the inexorable nature of time, against the financial reductionism of Sam, and against my own impending mortality that threatened to unleash the chaos of meaninglessness. I moved to the hearth room, where the bay window admitted the weak morning light. I paused at the depth groove, already marked, and remembered Mr. Finch's clipped dismissal. A cosmetic defect. The injustice of that phrase still burned. The groove was the precise intersection of pure childhood energy and solid Victorian craftsmanship. It was a scar left by joy. The house was talking back to me now, through the marker's sharp scent and the slight echo of my movements. I began to feel a profound merging with the building. I was not just Arthur, the old man. I was Arthur, the mechanism through which the house articulated its existence. My walk led me naturally back to the library corner armchair. This was the final and most personal annotation. The chair itself was a monument to quiet presence. It had absorbed decades of Eleanor's physical form, conforming to her specific shape, a subtle depression in the seat, the wear pattern on the right armrest, where she rested her hand, perpetually holding a book or perhaps just holding her quiet thoughts. I sat down, the old springs groaning a familiar, comforting protest. The scent of old velvet and lavender was strongest here. This chair was not just a piece of furniture. It was the physical embodiment of the quiet corner of our shared life. She used this corner not for escape, but for grounding. It was where she recharged the internal battery necessary to maintain the chaotic harmony of the Sterling home. I reached for the frame of the chair, avoiding the faded velvet, and found a small, firm section of wood beneath the armrest. I knew the label here had to encapsulate her essence and directly address the fear articulated in her note. I wrote slowly, with the reverence of engraving a tombstone, Eleanor's quiet corner, the anchor of home. Then, underneath that, a final defining statement, meant for no one but the heir, remembered by Arthur, until the silence. This inscription was the crescendo of my final act. It wasn't about Sam or the future buyers. It was about honoring the partnership, fulfilling the promise made decades ago, and finally alleviating the pressure of singularity. I put the marker down on the small side table. The silence returned, but its quality had changed entirely. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating blanket of unshared history. Now, it felt like the respectful hush of a library after closing hours, the archives secure, filed, and briefly protected. I leaned my head back against the worn velvet. I closed my eyes and allowed the memories to flood in without the pressure of needing to catalogue them further. They came in waves, untethered and complete. I saw Sam, not as the detached, financially focused man of 54, but as the small boy riding the bike, the sun glinting off the handlebars, the pure terror and triumph equally mingled on his face. The memory of the driveway retrospective, which had been so sharp earlier, returned with an almost painful clarity. It was the moment I realized my job was truly finite. Once he mastered the bike, he didn't need my running support. He was free, moving toward a horizon where I could not follow. This realization led to the profound, aching truth about Sam's current perspective. He saw the house as a financial asset because he had successfully detached himself from the need for this archive. He had built his own life, his own archive of successes and modern convenience. This house, for him, was merely the launching pad, the exhausted fuel capsule discarded after orbit was achieved. His inability to see the history wasn't malice. It was the necessary blindness required for progress. He was not burdened by nostalgia. He had escaped it entirely. And this, I realized, was the core of my terrible, beautiful burden. I was the last living witness, because I had chosen to remain tethered to the house. I had chosen to be the stationary point against which all other lives were measured, allowing the house to absorb and hold the energy that everyone else had taken with them into the future. The weight of the house's century of life, which I had feared would be released into the uncaring ether upon my death, now felt like a responsibility I had finally managed to partially discharge. The memories would vanish from the recalled history of the world, yes, but not before they were certified, etched onto the very skin of the container that held them. I thought about the sheer permanence of the architecture, juxtaposed with the fragile impermanence of human recall. The plaster, the oak, the stone, they endure. Our stories, told only once, are wind. But now, thanks to the marker, they were wind that had briefly impressed itself onto the stone. My body was weary, but my mind was at peace. The physical exhaustion of the nocturnal walk and the emotional exertion of the final cataloguing had taken their toll. The dread, that chilling silence I had so feared, seemed distant now, postponed indefinitely by my small, defiant act of narration. The true fear wasn't death. It was the ultimate, unheralded disappearance. It was the thought of a new owner, seeing the house only in terms of square footage and renovation potential, stripping away the built-in cabinetry, removing the walls that held the echoes of laughter, blind to the layered history beneath their feet. I imagined that hypothetical future owner standing in the hearthroom. They would see the new hardwood floor, perfectly sanded, the evidence of the depth groove eliminated. They would see the modernized kitchen, the ledger of heights painted over. They would see a piece of furniture, perhaps the library corner armchair, sitting in a consignment store, its purpose reduced to vintage velvet. But I had intervened. Even if the renovations were complete, the story, once told, could never be entirely unheard. The house, even if physically transformed, carried a secret note, the knowledge of its previous names, its assigned meaning. I had given the structure a voice, however faint. I remained in the chair, letting the morning deepen. The light outside grew stronger, but inside the archival residence, the shadows remained long and complex, preserving the intricate geometry of the past. The house was settling around me, groaning and creaking in its familiar, heavy way, the sound of wood contracting, the sound of history breathing. The feeling of abandonment, of being the sole librarian in a vast, empty library, still lingered, but it was overlaid with a quiet sense of triumph. I had done what Eleanor had asked. I had fought the silence with specificity. The ledger of heights, the depth groove, the rosemary shelf, the library corner armchair. They were no longer just passive artifacts. They were labeled archives, waiting patiently for the final dissolution. When the ability to recall the stories vanished, the physical scars would remain as footnotes, pointing toward a vibrant, complicated life lived fully within these walls. I took one final, slow breath, smelling the faint rosemary from the pantry and the old lavender from the chair. The house, vast and silent, was ready for its next chapter, whatever its new name might be. I had ensured that Arthur Preston Sterling and his family would remain an indelible, though hidden, part of its unwritten history. My duty was complete. The silence, for the first time in years, was profoundly peaceful. I rested. The initial sense of peace was deceptive, the momentary calm that follows a storm of intense, focused labor. My body, which had moved with the unnatural energy of a man on a mission, now sagged fully into the accommodating depths of the armchair. The house, which had previously held its breath during my nocturnal patrol, seemed to sigh with relief, its vast timber frame adjusting, protesting softly with the familiar creaks and groans that were its permanent language. I was no longer just labeling history. I was waiting for the history to label me. The fading scent of the permanent marker, sharp and chemical, was already giving way to the deeper, layered aromas of the house, the dust that smelled like dried paper, the specific earthiness of the old oak floorboards, and the enduring, gentle perfume of lavender that clung to the velvet of the chair, Eleanor's scent. I kept my eyes closed, not in sleep, but in a deliberate attempt to switch from the visual, tangible world of architecture to the pure, internal world of recall. The tactile evidence of my work, the inscription beneath the rosemary decanter, the faint markings near the water stain, the affirmation on the chair's frame, was secured. But the why, the intricate web of emotional dependency that necessitated this desperate act, was still throbbing within me. Sam. He remained the central counterpoint to this entire preservation project. His image, when I conjured it now, was detached, framed in the cold, neutral light of an office conference room. He saw numbers, he saw opportunity, he saw an inheritance that was inconveniently massive, yet strangely hollow. I reflected on his necessary blindness. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. To move forward successfully, Sam had required a degree of amnesia regarding this place. If he had carried the weight of the depth groove, the ledger of heights, and the profound scent of the copper pantry, he might never have left the gravitational pull of childhood. He had jettisoned history to achieve orbit, and I, Arthur, had been the ballast, the anchor that allowed the architecture to remain stationary, while the lives within it propelled themselves outward. My reward was this immense solitude, this unique burden of being the sole, final repository. The sun climbed higher, casting the dust motes dancing in the faint light, filtering through the grime-streaked window panes. I could hear the rhythmic, distant whine of a leaf blower from down the avenue, a sound of the present day, intrusive and uncowering. It shattered the sacred quiet I had cultivated. The house, in its silent, deep way, seemed to be urging me to confront the core of my fear one last time, to test the strength of my fragile archive against the relentless noise of the future. The labeled objects felt momentarily less monumental, reduced back to mere scratches on wood and stone, vulnerable to the first coat of primer or the first aggressive sanding machine. The ultimate betrayal, I realized, wouldn't come from Sam or from a new buyer eager for renovation. The ultimate betrayal would come from the walls themselves if they failed to hold the story, if the memory embedded in the plaster truly evaporated when the last person who knew it was gone. I stood, stretching my winery muscles, the ache in my knees a sharp reminder of my own diminishing permanence. I left the armchair and walked toward the bay window in the hearth room, where the sun warmed the worn oak floor. I placed my hand directly over the depth groove, 1978. Christmas morning. The physical scar was deep, permanent, but the sound, the high-pitched, triumphant roar Sam had made, imitating the fire engine siren. His face flushed with the fever of new possession. That sound was already fading in my inner ear, becoming a brittle echo. I bent low, tracing the gouge with my finger. It was here in this room that the vastness of the house's capacity for life was most evident. This space had absorbed the collective energy of decades, the clumsy attempts at ballroom dancing lessons with Eleanor, Catherine's sharp critiques of my youthful career choices, the solemn whispered conversations after David's departure for college. The inscriptions, I knew now, were not just markers. They were desperate pleas. I walked closer to the photograph. It was time to confront the source of this terror, the shared understanding I had tried to seal into the armchair's wooden frame. The pantry revelation, the note I found, had confirmed her fear, the terrifying notion that their shared life, so vibrant and real, would become just a vague, unvalidated whisper when we were both gone. A deep wave of guilt washed over me. When she was alive, she had never voiced this fear loudly. It was always an implied anxiety, tucked away in the way she meticulously archived her recipes or carefully labeled the holiday ornaments before placing them in the attic. She was trying to impose order on time itself. I remembered a specific afternoon, perhaps 10 years after Catherine was gone, when Eleanor was truly beginning to take over the mantle of home guardian. It was a dull late autumn Tuesday, and the house felt especially heavy, the silence punctuated only by the drip of the kitchen faucet. I moved through the hearth room and into the kitchen, drawn physically toward the ghost of that moment. I stopped near the ceramic sink, running my hand along the cool, chipped porcelain edge. The faucet was still the original, heavy chrome, prone to that exact, irritating drip. New memory, climax. Eleanor had been standing right here, washing dishes, her back to me. She was wearing a thick, knitted cardigan over her apron. I had come in from the cold, smelling of damp leaves and pipe tobacco. "It's getting dark early," Idie said, mundane observation covering a deeper weariness. She hadn't stopped scrubbing a stubborn part. "Arthur," Sherd said, her voice low, "do you think the walls feel lighter when we are not here?" The question had startled me. It was so unlike her usual practical conversation. "Lighter, Eleanor? I don't follow." She paused then, resting the copper pot in the sink. She didn't turn round, but I saw the reflection of her face in the kitchen window glass, a look of profound melancholy that cut me to the quick. "It's all in us, Arthur," Shed whispered. "The noise, the love, the sheer volume of life we've poured into this structure. When Sam is here, or when the children visited, the house has purpose. But when it's just you and me, it feels like we're holding it all up, like we're the last two pillars supporting the entire history." She finally turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes, usually so warm and steady, held a deep, watery fear. "I'm afraid, Arthur, that when the pillars crumble, the whole narrative collapses. And then, it's just wood and plaster again. Just square footage." I had gone to her, embracing her, feeling the solid comfort of her body. "The house loves you, Eleanor. It knows your rhythm. It will remember." She had leaned back, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "The house may remember, my love, but who will remember the house remembering?" That was the terrifying elegance of her statement. The memories were trapped. The capacity to voice them, the human connection required to give them meaning and currency, would be gone. The history of this house wasn't written in stone. It was written in our breath, our footsteps, and our shared recognition. Standing there now, 81 years old, and alone by the sink, the full, devastating weight of her question settled on me. Who will remember the house remembering? This was the emotional core of my solitude, the intense moment of realization that elevated my mission from mere nostalgia to a sacred duty. The silence she feared was not just the absence of sound, but the absence of validation. I leaned my forehead against the cool window frame above the sink. The markers, the labels, they were my answer to Eleanor. Decades too late. I couldn't insure a reader, but I could insure a text. I realized I had one crucial area left to address, one massive, impersonal space that needed to be claimed: the exterior. The facade of the archival residence, the grand Victorian face that presented itself to the uncaring world. This was the shell that Sam saw as an asset, and the appraiser saw as dated. I walked back through the dining room, past the heavy mahogany table where countless arguments and celebrations had been staged. The internal tour was over. Now, the final act of documentation needed to be external. A statement directed at the street, the neighborhood, and the indifferent timeline of the town. I retrieved my worn, heavy jacket from the hall closet and slipped on my boots. The morning air outside would be crisp, cleansing, and brutally honest. The front door, thick and heavily paneled, opened with a familiar, deep thud. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind me, isolating myself from the inner warmth of the labeled house. I looked back at the grand structure. 3 stories of rambling Victorian architecture, weathered grey siding, deep green trim, and the characteristic turret that housed the sunniest corner of the second floor. It was a monolith, a silent, powerful vessel of the past. My eyes focused on the long, winding concrete driveway. This was the setting for the driveway retrospective, the pivotal moment that had cemented Sam's independence and, consequently, my stationary status. The driveway was cracked now, weeds pushing through the seams, marked by oil stains from cars long gone. But 60 years ago, it had been a perfect sloping runway for learning. I walked slowly down the porch steps, the worn wood protesting slightly beneath my weight. I crossed the small, manicured lawn and stood at the top of the driveway, looking down the slope. I could see the ghosts clearly. Eleanor, hovering nervously near the garage door, trying not to micromanage. Sam, perhaps 7 years old, too big for his first bike but fiercely determined. And me, running alongside him, one hand gripping the back of the small seat, providing the crucial, terrifying support that separates falling from flying. The memory had a distinct soundtrack, the frantic clicking of the bicycle chain, Sam's concentrated grunts, and my own slightly labored breathing. I saw the moment of release. We had reached the midpoint of the driveway, and Sam had found his center of gravity. His eyes, fixed straight ahead, were pure concentration. His legs moved with a sudden, powerful rhythm. I released my grip. For a terrifying second, he wobbled, a near crash that tightened every muscle in my body. Then, pure balance. He was flying. He didn't look back. He didn't even yell. He simply roared, propelled by his own newly discovered ability, all the way to the end of the driveway and onto the quiet, tree-lined avenue. I remember standing there, my hand still instinctively reaching for the empty space where the bike had been. I was irrelevant to that flight. I was left behind, on the fixed ground. It was this image that contrasted so violently with the image of the contemporary Sam, the detached businessman who saw only square footage. The house had sheltered that metamorphosis, but it also suffered the consequence of the successful flight. Just as I stood contemplating the cracked concrete, a flash of movement caught my eye. Down the avenue, near the curve, a young couple was attempting the exact same ritual with their own child. a small bicycle with training wheels, a nervous mother, and a father running, slightly stooped, clutching the back of the seat. The sight was a brutal, perfect mirroring. I watched the father release his child, watched the inevitable wobble, and watched the small figures surge forward in a chaotic, joyful burst of speed. It was the final nail in the coffin of my unique ownership of the memory. The exact moment, the exact fear, the exact joy was being reproduced 80 feet away, utterly disconnected from the history of my own family. The event, once unique and sacred to the Sterling family archive, was merely a universal human milestone, repeated endlessly, anonymously. This external observation triggered the necessary confrontation. The house holds the stories, but the stories themselves are common currency. It is I who makes them unique. I walked down the driveway, the crunch of gravel under my boots mixing with the distant sounds of the neighborhood child's triumphant, wobbly cry. I needed a final inscription, an external warning, a physical protest against the anonymity of progress. I reached the large stone pillar that marked the end of the property line, a solid column of grey granite, meant to hold a heavy Castilian lantern that had rusted away decades ago. It was permanent, exposed, and impossible to overlook. I pulled the black marker from my jacket pocket. My hand was steady now, infused with a deep, final resolve. I wrote directly onto the rough granite, a declaration aimed at the street, at Sam's rational eye, and at the eventual, unsuspecting new owner. This is not square footage. I paused, realizing the simple phrase was inadequate. It needed names. It needed the full weight of the burden I had carried. I added, beneath the first line, "This is Arthur, Eleanor, Catherine." And then, the ultimate summary, my final word on the nature of this place, addressing Eleanor's terrible question about the house, remembering the architecture holds the echoes, and the witness is gone. I stepped back, examining the stark black markings against the cold grey stone. It was ugly, defiant, and beautifully true. It didn't explain the depth groove or the ledger of heights. It simply affirmed the existence of the archive. It told the world a life was lived here. Proceed with caution. I had given the house its epitaph. The cold was beginning to seep through my jacket. My duty felt unequivocally complete. I had faced the dread, the silence, and the ultimate, terrifying prospect of meaninglessness, and I had fought back with an inventory. I turned and walked back up the long, cracked driveway toward the front door. The house loomed, no longer a heavy burden, but a co-conspirator, a sealed archive now equipped with an index and a warning label. I reached the front door, slipping my key into the heavy brass lock. The warmth of the interior, the faint lingering scent of rosemary and lavender, embraced me like an old, trusted friend. I didn't return to the hearthroom or the armchair. I went straight to the kitchen, seeking the simple, steady comfort of the familiar. I stood by the doorframe, touching the faint pencil marks of the ledger of heights, the testament to decades of growth. I looked at the black marker inscription I had added earlier, A.P. Sterling, 2024. The last keeper. I was the last keeper, and now the contents were sealed. I went to the back porch, where the morning sun streamed through the glass panels, warming the flagstone floor. I sat on the old wooden bench, letting the light soak into my face. The house was settling again, its gentle symphony of creaks and ticks confirming its continued existence, its deep commitment to permanence. The fear had vanished, replaced by a profound, if melancholic, acceptance. When the chilling silence inevitably descended, when my breath became just another echo absorbed into the plaster, the history would not be annihilated. It would simply be rendered illegible to the future, preserved only in the physical scars I had meticulously certified. I had done what was necessary. I had paid the final tribute to Eleanor's quiet guardianship and Catherine's formidable spirit. I had protected the memory of Sam's triumph and my own steady presence. The true dilemma of my existence, bearing the beautiful, terrifying burden of being the only person who remembers, was finally resolved. The burden was transferred. It was etched into the wood, the stone, and the granite. I closed my eyes, the sun warm on my skin. I did not fear the silence anymore. I invited it. The archive was secure. Arthur, the archivist, could rest. The house, the archival residence, stood ready, its secret shave, waiting for the long, quiet century ahead. The memories were trapped within the walls, precisely where they belonged. Smash the like button, join the squad.